Every once in a while, I find that God gives us a chance to honor someone that's had a significant impact in our life. And this is one of these moments for me. I'm deeply grateful to introduce you to United States Congressman Frank Wolf. Congressman Wolf has been in Congress for 33 years. You can do the math. His career has spanned the presidencies of Reagan, Bush Sr., Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama. They have come and gone. Congressman Wolf is still here. He is the most senior of the 11 members of the U.S. House of Representatives from Virginia. He represents the 10th District of Virginia, which stretches from McLean out to Front Royal. He sits on the powerful House Appropriations Committee, where he's the chairman of the Subcommittee of Commerce, Justice, Science, and Related Agencies. He also serves on the Subcommittee of Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development, Related Agencies, and also helped to initiate the Iraq Study Group, which was very influential in helping this issue in Iraq come to an end. He's the co-chairman of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, a bipartisan organization of many members of Congress who work together to raise awareness about international human rights issues. Born in Philadelphia, the son of a police officer, Frank Wolf overcame a stuttering problem and other challenges to come to a place of leadership. He earned his bachelor's degree from Penn State and his law degree from Georgetown. He's married to Carolyn, I can testify, the real secret of his success, and has 5 children and 15 grandchildren. And I thought I'd read briefly a quote. There's a book I would highly recommend called Prisoner of Conscience. It's the autobiography of Congressman Wolf. Came out recently, published by Zondervan. And in the foreword, Chuck Colson wrote a note about his friend Frank Wolf. And those of us that would know Chuck Colson, obviously was a trustee here at the school, passed recently, a huge blow to the evangelical world. But he just wrote the foreword for the book. And I thought I'd just read a brief word from Chuck Colson about his friend Frank Wolf. He said, Frank, father of 5, vowed not to sacrifice his family, reserved Sundays for church and family, and installed a special phone line in his office for the exclusive use of his wife and kids. If the phone rings, no matter what he's doing or how important his visitors, he answers that phone. Frank is the conscience of the house. There is no one in American public life I admire more than Frank Wolf. Like the late Mother Teresa, he measures himself by faithfulness, not success. Political and religious freedom fighters around the world and advocates for the world's poor consider Frank Wolf a hero. So do I. This humble, self-effacing man has earned the grateful thanks of everyone from Romanian defectors to Darfurian rape victims to the Dalai Lama. Frank's passion for justice is the reason he became the second person to which Prison Fellowship awarded the Wilberforce Award, given annually to an individual who has made a difference in the face of formidable societal problems and injustices. Frank is a living embodiment of the biblical command to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God, Micah 6:8. I am proud to call him my friend. Chuck Colson, February 21st, 2011. And just lastly, on a personal note, Frank and his wife Carolyn have attended the church where my father is a pastor since 1974. They sit back right, 9:30 service, and just grateful for your impact in my life. Thank you at certain points when I was trying to discern calling that you helped me see that it's a holistic call that God calls us to in every sphere of life. And I also was able to intern with him in 2000, gave me kindly my first job, and then in 2004 worked on his re-election campaign. And so thank you again for that impact on our family. And I'm more than honored to welcome to the podium a servant of our country, public servant for over 30 years, but most importantly, a servant of our mighty Lord, Congressman Frank Wolf.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Andrew. I appreciate the comments. And Daniel, some of what I want to say here, really what Daniel just said. Nigeria, the Christian community in Nigeria is being slaughtered, and no one in the church in the West is speaking out for them. Morocco, when the Christians were expelled from Morocco, we couldn't get anybody in the Christian church in the West to speak out for them. So you kind of set up really what I'm going to talk about today. In preparing for my time with you, I noted on Gordon-Conwell's website that the seminary hosts students from 50 different countries. And in many ways, as I look around, you reflect the church, capital C, hailing from many nations, tribes, and tongues. I venture that those of you who are international students will likely return to your home countries as leaders steeped in the knowledge of the Word and prepared for a life of service to Christ's bride, the church. Given the diversity represented here, I venture that for some, service will come almost certainly with a great cost. As in many places around the globe, oppression, discrimination, and persecution are the order of the day, particularly for people who want to honestly and faithfully follow Jesus. I intend to spend the latter part of my remarks today focusing on the plight of the persecuted church globally and the obligation that, quite frankly, I think the church has failed on, the church in the West, to advocate for our besieged brothers and sisters around the world. But before delving into that realm, I wanted to spend some time, because many of you are going to be pastors, a bit closer to home. While I serve in elective office, I'm keenly aware that the problems facing our country today are not purely political, or even, honestly, mostly political, and as such, the solutions will not ultimately come from government. This is not to say that political leadership is unimportant. In fact, Scripture tells us that, quote, when the godly are in authority, the people rejoice, but when the wicked are in power, they groan. I pray and would urge you to pray for those in positions of influence in our government, that they may be men and women who act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with God. But I believe, even as one serving in government, that we do our nation a disservice if we assume that we can solve all of our problems politically. For I would argue there is something far greater that is ailing our country. Something that is profoundly moral in nature, something which necessitates a spiritual antidote, something which demands, in the words of Frenchman Alexis de Tocqueville, speaking of the American church he beheld in the 19th century, pulpits aflame with righteousness. Today in America, we bear witness to an insidious relativism that teaches that concept of right and wrong are old-fashioned, antiquated, even judgmental. Vices are elevated, virtues are mocked, faith is squeezed out of the public square, our culture is coarsened as a result. These seemingly intangible realities have a profound implication. In fact, the fastest growing religious affiliation in America today is, in the words of columnist Michael Gerson, who was Chuck Colson's speechwriter, the nuns, as in none of the above. This group comprises nearly 20% of the population and a third of adults under 30, and otherwise known as the millennials. The Barna Group recently fleshed out this trend by examining those 18 to 29-year-olds who formerly identified themselves closely with faith in the church, but who have since begun to wrestle with that identity. Their analysis found that between high school and turning 30, 43% of these previously engaged millennials drop out from regular church attendance. To put that in numerical terms, it's a staggering over 8 million 20-somethings who have, for various reasons, given up on the church or given up on Christianity. This is a sobering trend, although perhaps a bit more complex than the numbers suggest. To be sure, there is cause for concern, but there is cause for strategic vision, prayer, and I would say even at times hope. I read with great interest a piece by Jim Daly with Focus on the Family, who noted that the millennial generation as a whole is often not hostile to Christianity, rather they're apathetic. They're weary of polarization and value civility. They have a strong desire to serve, and those that do attend church tend to be attracted to churches that have an outward focus. They seek transparency, humility, and integrity in leaders, and most have a positive, albeit often biblically uninformed, view of Jesus. Importantly, Daly also noted that the millennial Christians have little patience for a diluted doctrine and a listless teaching. Arguably, it is the millennials themselves, including many of you, who are best positioned to reach their peers. We do ourselves and Jesus a disservice if we seek to water down his life and message in the hopes of drawing others in. An anemic version of Christianity that is only modestly different than the culture of our day is not the answer. To understand how the church must respond, we must first understand what is taking place in the broader culture. There is much that could be said on this score, but given the time limitations, I will focus on one component, namely the elevation of tolerance as the premier virtue. Without question, there are merits to tolerance. But when tolerance is demanded, when Orthodox Christianity is deemed intolerant, and when government and even society fails to extend tolerance to people of faith, we are headed down a perilous path. Strikingly, this is the very road we find ourselves traveling. Putting aside the politics of issues like marriage and health care, there are undeniable and frankly deeply troubling implications for the church given the present national direction. While the current marriage debate has centered around the notion of same-sex unions, in reality there has been a decades-long cultural assault on marriage. What was once recognized almost universally as a God-ordained and created institution, the fundamental building block of any society, and the nexus of procreation and child-rearing has now been called into question both in the larger culture and increasingly in the legal framework which governs this land. Same-sex marriage aside, marriage is now widely viewed as purely an emotional bond. With this as the starting point, we are left arguing the merits of one person's love for another. This evolution did not happen overnight. The last several decades have been marked by the adoption of no-fault divorce laws in every state, the normalization of cohabitation before marriage, and the steep rise in single motherhood. These trends are set against the backdrop of the ravages of pornography, and pornography is spreading everywhere in this country. Abortion on demand, and the objectification of women in music, film, and virtually every other form of media. And yet, in many respects, the church, in the face of decades-long challenge to marriage, has struggled to find its voice, adopting in some areas the ethos not unlike the broader culture of 20 years ago. Of course, there are many exceptions, but generally speaking, rather than having a radical alternative to the culture, we are in too many ways simply culture light. Precisely what Christian millennials that we need to attract said they do not want. Consider the following. Last summer, I joined with former Congressman Tony Hall, a Democrat from Ohio, my best friend in Congress, in writing 50 leading Protestant church leaders from around the country, beseeching them to lend their voice to the public debate on marriage. We wrote these leaders following the president's announcement that he had changed his position on gay marriage. The letter read in part, quote, "Talking heads and strategists in Washington are busy analyzing what constituencies have been mobilized, energized, secured, or alienated by the timing of the president's announcement. But the implications of this shift are far more reaching than November's electoral outcome." We went on to say, "We believe the president's position, which he sought to justify by citing Scripture, necessitates a response, not only a political response, but a reasoned, winsome, faithful interpretation of what Scripture actually has to say about God's intent for the sacred institution of marriage. As is befitting those who identify themselves as followers of Jesus," we said, "this apologetic for marriage must be seasoned with grace, kindness, and love, while also grounded in truth." We concluded the letter by saying, on this issue, as in so many others, the discussion among government leaders and opinion makers is simply downstream manifestation of what is already happening in the broader culture. which is why your leadership, we said, is so important. This sentence encapsulates well today's topic for this discussion. To our great disappointment, we heard back from just 3 pastors. 3. I'm a great admirer of Princeton University's Robbie George, himself a Catholic, who is fully engaged in this ongoing national conversation and is a prolific thinker and writer on these very topics. In the First Things post this past summer, he offered up, by his own description, an unlicensed sermon. It is, I believe, a fitting clarion call to the church, especially to future leaders of the church, such as yourselves. Here's what Robbie George says, quote, "A little Sunday sermon from a guy with no license to preach. For those of us who are Christian, and I suspect that is same is true of our friends of other religious traditions, it is tempting to embrace those doctrines and teachings of our faith that are acceptable to the beautiful people, to the trendsetters and the opinion shapers, to the powerful and influential, while going silent on or even denying those teachings that will mark us as standing in opposition to the values that dominate in elite sectors of the culture. We're all too willing to be tame Christians," Robbie George said. "We want the comforts and consolation of religion, but we like to have them without risk or without cost. We don't want to jeopardize friendships. We don't want to jeopardize family relationships, professional and economic opportunities, prestige, social status, or the like. We don't want people to think of us as retrograde or out of touch with the times, much less as intolerant or prejudiced. So we're tempted to pick and choose to be, quote, cafeteria Christians. But if we're serious about our faith, we will understand that a true Christian is never a tame Christian. A true Christian will stand up and speak out for what is good and true, what is right and just, both in season and out of season. He or she will not go silent, even when hearing witness is unpopular, even when it is personally or professionally risky. He or she will know that there is truly a cost of discipleship and will be prepared with God's help and by the grace to pay that cost, whatever it turns out to be. A faithful Christian will be ever mindful of the words of Christ himself. If anyone would be my disciple, then let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me." End of quote. Increasingly, I am of the mind that Christians, especially those in position of authority, are going to face situations that are not simply culturally unpopular, but conceivably situations where force us to choose between God and Caesar, between our conscience and the law. Cardinal Francis George, former president of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops and the current Archbishop of Chicago in 2010, predicted, quote, "I expect to die in my bed. My successor will die in prison, and his successor will die a martyr in the public square." Is this alarmist? Unnecessarily dramatic? I pray so. But the evidence before us at least demands an examination of the prospect. In June of this year, Cardinal George wrote, quote, "This tendency for the government to claim for itself authority on all areas of human experience flows from the secularization of our culture." He said, "If God cannot be part of public life, then the state itself plays God." Breakpoint, a legacy of the late Chuck Colson, recently aired a piece titled "Too High a Price for Citizenship," which features the Elan photography versus Whitlock case out of the New Mexico Supreme Court, which ruled August 22nd that Elan could not refuse to photograph a same-sex wedding. John Stonestreet, who authored this Breakpoint piece, pointed out that the more troubling than the court's actual ruling was, quote, "the reasoning it employed to justify its decision. Every appeal to religious freedom was swept aside as if the phrase free exercise did not even appear anywhere in the Constitution. In vindicating the right of one minority, same-sex couples, the court rendered null the rights of another, namely people of faith who adhere to traditional teachings about sexuality." End of quote. In short, the court or the state played God. It is in this context that the church, more than ever, must be a prophetic voice. At other critical junctures in human history, Christian leaders of great consequence often reserve their most severe criticism for their fellow believers, not out of a spirit of harshness, but rather love and a desire that the church fulfill its calling. The Reverend Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail. If you haven't read it, read it. Read it, and for those of you who are going to be pastors, read it every year, but read it. It is addressed to his fellow clergymen. In it, he explains with great eloquence and relevance for today the difference between a just law and an unjust law, writing, quote, "A just law is a man-made code that squares with a moral law or the law of God. An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with moral law." He went on to say, we should never forget that everything Adolf Hitler did in Germany was legal. And everything the Hungarian freedom fighters did in Hungary was illegal. It was illegal to aid and comfort a Jew in Hitler's Germany, he said. Even so, he said, I am sure that had I lived in Germany at that time, he said, I would have aided and comforted my Jewish brothers. If today I lived in a communist country where certain principles dear to the Christian faith are suppressed, I would openly advocate disobeying the country's anti-religious laws. Talk to your colleagues that are part of house churches in China. King continues, admonishing the church. He said, I must honestly reiterate that I have been disappointed with the church. When I was suddenly catapulted into the leadership of the bus protest in Montgomery, Alabama, a few years ago, he said, I felt I would be supported by the white church. I felt that the white ministers and priests and rabbis of the South would be among our strongest allies. Instead, he said, some have been outright opponents. All too many others have been more cautious than courageous and have remained silent behind the anesthetizing security of stained glass windows. What a stirring indictment from a man of the cloth, written to fellow clergymen as he languishes behind bars in Alabama. Are we in 2013 more cautious than courageous? You answer it. I think I know the answer, but you answer it. Are we in 2013 willing to risk imprisonment in the face of unjust laws? Your brethren in China? In Vietnam? They're going to jail for what they believe in. They're house church leaders. They know. These are profound questions of conscience which every man and woman, particularly those who are going to be in the church, but even those who are not in the church, must answer for themselves. King goes on to say, and I quote, in deep disappointment, I have wept over the laxity of the church. But be assured that my tears have been tears of love. He said, there was a time when the early Christians rejoiced at being deemed worthy to suffer for what they believed. He said, in those days, the church was not merely a thermometer that recorded the ideas and principles of popular opinion. It was a thermostat that transformed the mores of society. Whenever the early Christians entered a town, the people in power became disturbed and immediately sought to convict the Christians for being disturbers of the peace and outside agitators. By their effort and example, they brought an end to such ancient evils as infanticide and gladiator contest. And then he concludes, things are different now. So often the contemporary church is a weak, ineffectual voice with an uncertain sound. So often it is an arch defender of the status quo. Far from being disturbed by the presence of the church, the power structure of the average community is consoled by the church's silent and often even vocal sanction of things they see. But the judgment of God is upon the church as never before. He said, if today's church does not recapture the sacrificial spirit of the early church, it will lose its authenticity, forfeit the loyalty of millions, and we see where the millennials are gone, and be dismissed as an irrelevant social club with no meaning for the 20th century. Several weeks ago, thousands gathered in Washington to mark the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington. King gave his life for the cause of justice and freedom, but ultimately his dream was realized. Just like Esther of old and countless others whose names we do not know, I know God raises up prophets at the time, as the times demand, and I pray that similar voices would emerge for the 21st century. Maybe at least one of you. Just one. Maybe not the whole, just one. I also pray that as the cost becomes greater to follow Jesus in a post-Christian America, we might find people being drawn to faith through the authentic witness displayed in the disciples' obedience. Which brings me now, with so many internationally, to the church overseas, notably the persecuted church, what seems to have really been forgotten about by the church in the West. Several years ago, around the time of the 20th anniversary of the Tiananmen Square crackdown, a story ran on a local radio station which features several Tiananmen survivors, a sort of where are they now piece. One of the featured individuals was a gentleman who at one point was number 17 on the Chinese government's most wanted Tiananmen protesters list. He eventually sought asylum and now pastors a large Chinese American church near my congressional district in the state of Virginia. His sermons are recorded and put online for converts inside of China to download. Pastor Boli, B-O-L-I, described his job as letting, quote, the love of Jesus Christ melt the hatred in China. Upon hearing his remarkable story, I invited him to my office for a meeting. As is so often the case, as Andrew knows, when Congress is in session, a series of votes are called right as we begin to meet, requiring that I walk over to the Capitol with my meeting in tow. On this particular day, we happened upon some visiting Chinese tourists at the foot of the Capitol steps. This couple was visiting their son in the U.S., who himself was a seminary student, I think at Trinity in Chicago. While we share no common language, it was incredibly apparent that they recognized Pastor Boli. They regularly watched this pastor teaching online. They were overjoyed to meet him. They couldn't believe that they were actually meeting him in Washington, D.C. at the foot of the steps of the Capitol, and they had watched him online. I later asked this Chinese-American pastor if he felt it was more difficult to be a Christian in the U.S. or in China. He answered unequivocally and counterintuitively that it was more difficult in America. Perhaps not difficult in the ways we would think. There are certainly tangible threats to religious freedom in the U.S., which I just described, but really no one is being arrested for going to an unregistered church, as some of your colleagues here can attest to. No one is being beaten for administering the Holy Communion. Chris Smith took Holy Communion from Bishop Su in China, and Bishop Su was beaten and taken away and never seen again, except one day they saw him in a black car going somewhere, but never seen again. But this pastor's answer certainly was thought-provoking and caused me to question whether the lure toward tame Christianity of the sort Robbie George described was in some way more insidious and threatening than the actual promise of physical persecution. In fact, persecution is as old as the church. Horrific tales of persecution are not simply relegated to the ancient history books. Author Ellen Hursky, who you may have had here at some time, notes that the suffering church today constitutes nearly a third of the total Christian population. Looking to the Middle East, there is often societal and communal violence and repression against religious communities, which specifically targets religious minorities, including Christians. These realities have been exacerbated by the so-called Arab Spring, a spring which has devolved into winter for many of those vulnerable in these societies, foremost among them the ancient Christian communities. In February, I traveled to the Middle East. I go to the Middle East quite frequently, specifically to Lebanon and Egypt. We met with Mama Maggie and a group of Copts in Egypt, and we also went down into the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon and met with a number of Syrians and Sunni and Alawite, but a number of Syrian Christians who came out from Damascus to meet with me. One of the main purposes of the trip was to spend some time, as I said, with Syrian Christian community, a community with ancient roots dating back to the first century. We read in the Bible about Paul on the road to Damascus. Once in Damascus, I actually went to the site where you read about the basket coming down and the actual site where Paul, it's the beginning, if you will. I wanted to hear firsthand from Syrian Christians about their concerns and to put this issue in a larger context of an imperiled Christian community in the broader Middle East, specifically in Egypt and in Iraq. Coptic Christians and other minorities in Egypt are increasingly marginalized with the ascendancy of the Muslim Brotherhood. Of course, recent events in Egypt seem to indicate a rejection in part of the Brotherhood's approach. But the situation is fluid, and recent news reports indicate that Islamists are taking advantage of the unrest to target Coptic Christians. The issues I've just outlined must be viewed not simply as today's news, but rather through the lens of history. A phrase not often heard outside the majority Muslim world is, first the Saudi people, then the Sunni people. The Saudi people are, of course, the Jewish people. Except for Israel, their once vibrant communities and countries throughout the region are now decimated. In 1948, when I was alive, and some of you were alive, the Jewish population of Iraq was roughly 150,000. Today, no more than 4 remain, and some reports indicate there may actually be just 1 Jewish person left in Iraq. In Egypt, the Jewish population was once as many as 80,000, now roughly 20. I met with the leader of the Jewish community, and she said it's 20 more or less, and she says it's probably less. It appears a similar fate may await the ancient Christian community in these same lands. With the fall of Mubarak, Coptic Christians numbering near roughly 8 to 10 million are leaving in droves in the face of increased repression, persecution, and violence. Similarly, Iraq's Christian population has fallen from as many as 1.4 million in 2003 to roughly 500,000 today, and some say it could be as low as 300,000. Churches have been targeted, believers kidnapped for ransom, and families threatened with violence if they stay. Over the span of a few decades, the Middle East, with the exception of Israel, has virtually been emptied of the Jewish community. In my conversations with the Syrian Christian refugees, Lebanese Christians, and Coptic Christians in Egypt, a resounding theme emerged. A similar fate may await the Sunni people. While it remains to be seen whether the historic exodus of Christians from the region will prove to be as dramatic as what has already happened to the Jewish community, it is without question devastating as it threatens to erase Christianity from its very, very roots. I know Dr. Cooley, who used to be the head of the seminary. The Christian community may very well be eradicated from the area that he studied of archaeology from. Consider Iraq. On my first trip when the war broke out, I went to Iraq. We snuck in with a NGO because the government wouldn't let me go. We went up to a place called Nasiriyah, and I showed my ID to the soldiers, and I said, I'm a congressman, I'm from America. They brought me in. They said, you know what is here? Nasiriyah is With the exception of Israel, the Bible contains more reference to the cities, regions, and nations of ancient Iraq than any other country. The patriarch Abraham came from the city in Iraq called When I was there, I climbed the ziggurat, which is 2200 BC. You get some Bibles that I've seen that has the picture of the ziggurat. They took me to this site that they said, this is the site of Abraham's village. Rebecca came from northwest Iraq. Jacob spent 20 years in Iraq, and his sons, the 12 tribes of Israel, were born in northwest Iraq. A remarkable spiritual revival, as told in the book of Jonah, occurred in Nineveh. Nineveh is Mosul, but Nineveh. And the events of the book of Esther took place in Iraq, as did the account of one of the great men of the Bible, Daniel. Daniel, Babylon, the lion's den, Iraq. In Egypt, some 2,000 years ago, Mary, Joseph, and Jesus sought refuge in this land from the murderous aims of King Herod. Egypt's Coptic community traces its origins to the Apostle Mark. If the Middle East is effectively emptied of Christian faith, this will have grave geopolitical and, I would argue, spiritual implications. But rather than being met with urgency, vision, or creativity, our government's response has been anemic and at times outright baffling, especially to the communities most impacted by the changing Middle East landscape. This, coupled with virtual silence on the part of the church in the West, and these vulnerable faith communities, which are part of the fabric of the historic Middle East, are left feeling abandoned and alone during the hour of greatest need. When I go into the region, they say to me, and I see my good friend Peter Kuzmic, who, and I know in Eastern Europe, they felt abandoned at times. They said, does the church in the West care about us? Do they talk about us? Are they thinking about us? Well, the situation is grim in the Middle East. It is hardly an anomaly. The church is under assault elsewhere in the world. Far be it from me to tell some of you who come from those regions, but like many repressive regimes throughout history, the Chinese government maintains a brutal system of labor camps. Common criminals languish behind bars with Nobel laureates who dare to question the regime's authority and people of faith. In February 2013, Christianity Today Peace reported, quote, China's Christians felt a noticeable rise in persecution in 2012 as the communist government began the first of a three-phase plan to eradicate unregistered house churches, a new report says. The article continued at least 132 instances of persecution affecting 4,919 Christians, 442 of whom were clergy, were reported in the country last year, according to China's Aid annual report. That's Bob Fu, who many of you may know. Currently, every one of the approximately 25 underground bishops of the Catholic Church is either in jail, under house arrest, under strict surveillance, or in hiding, according to the Cardinal Kuhn Foundation. Protestant house church pastors are routinely intimidated, imprisoned, and sometimes tortured. The government of China is an equal opportunity persecutor of people of faith. For the past 2 years, over 100 peaceful, loving Tibetans have set themselves aflame in desperation at the abuses suffered by the people. Their people. Muslim Uyghurs are unable to freely associate and have been subject to forced confessions and persecution. Reba Kadir, who's head of the Uyghur community, lives in Northern Virginia, and her 2 boys are in jail, and she can't get our government to do anything at all about it. In North Korea, arguably the darkest corner of the globe today, there is a remnant of Christianity that survives, and some argue is even growing in the face of horrific persecution, including torture, multi-generational imprisonment, and death. Writing in the Wall Street Journal, Melanie Kirkpatrick, a former deputy editor of the journal's editorial page and author of Escape from North Korea, The Untold Story of Asia's Underground Railroad, explained that despite this repression, something is happening that many characterize as nothing short of a miracle. Christianity appears to be growing in North Korea. She further reported that the regime has stepped up the campaign against Christians. In recent years, it trains police and soldiers about the dangers of religion and sends agents posing as refugees into China to infiltrate churches. Sometimes the agents even set up fake prayer meetings to catch worshipers. The government of Vietnam, which our own State Department describes as an authoritarian state ruled by a single party, continues to suppress political dissent and severely limit freedom of expression, association, and public assembly. Religious activists are subject to arbitrary arrest. Iranian-American pastor Saeed Abedini languishes in jail in Iran. More than 900 Nigerian Christians were killed. 900 were killed last year. A Pakistani Christian teen falsely accused of blasphemy was recently forced to flee the country or face communal violence. And as I was preparing this and getting ready, the paper on Monday, 85 Christians in Pakistan. 85 Christians in Pakistan. And the one lady said, every Christian is feeling under siege in Pakistan. 85 killed in All Saints Church with an attack. Jesus of Nazareth had much to say about the persecuted, the oppressed, and the imprisoned. But is the church in the West today burdened by the great injustice of religious persecution? Not because we're driven by guilt, but because we are motivated by our faith. Not because of some tired sense of obligation, but because of a vibrant biblical mandate. Returning to the theme of today's talk, I'm increasingly convinced that the discussion or lack thereof among government leaders and opinion makers on this issue of religious persecution is simply a downstream manifestation of what is happening in the broader culture, and specifically in the faith community domestically. If the church in the West has failed to prioritize the plight of the church globally, can we reasonably expect government leaders to do so? In closing, as you continue your studies and prepare for a life of ministry, which for some will involve the important work of shepherding the flock, I urge you to be clear-eyed about the times in which we live, to be thoughtful about the challenges, and prayerful about your response, and to never be satisfied with a tame Christianity, no matter the cost. Thank you very much.